a little small town, 2 counties outside of Atlanta, Georgia. Thank you, Yvette, so much. You made me look good. And thank you so much for having us and for having me. I indeed look at it as a pleasure whenever I can come and share. And I just ask that you walk and pray with me as we go down a little bit of history. What can I say to you today about community service that you don't already know, aren't already practicing in your day-to-day life, and now in your new section? How can I expand on the ideals of what it means to render service in our communities? Service, unlike volunteering, which is not always of the will, is done for a myriad of reasons. And as an organization, we are required to involve ourselves in a number of ways, especially where it relates to the African American woman and her family. It's no secret that the Black woman has always been in the forefront of making it happen and getting it done. So this evening, I want to focus on the history and the impact that Black women have made through service to our people and to our country. Pray with me as I attempt to illustrate the features and benefits of community service at its best. In Africa, before and even during slavery, community is all we had. Recall our own recent history where the telling of how our people shared whatever means they had with each other, often pulling together to make a meal so that all could be fed. Remember the days when your grandmother would send you down the street to her friend's house to borrow some sugar. Would you call that community service? Yeah. I ask because I envision a broader meaning of what we now call community service. I like to see it as taking care of each other. You see, if we just go back to the days of it when each street in the neighborhood with lending and just sharing, even in the raising of our children, every child would be fed and every household would be accountable for the upbringing of our young people. Now indeed, the term community is a vast description of many streets and neighborhoods, and I would not dare venture to tell you to limit your services to only those you know. For our history tells us that during and after the Civil War, numerous Black women's church and civic organizations sent material aid to war veterans and their families. Groups like the Kansas Relief Association, organized by Joseph St. Pereira Ruffin, provided funds for Black migrants. Mary Ellen Pleasant, who became wealthy by speculating on the California gold rush, underwrote the building of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the AME Zion Church, and the Baptist Church in San Francisco, though she herself was a practicing Catholic. One known only as Mrs. Madison, who, although living in a humble and unpretending home, succeeded in opening a home for aged colored women. And let us not forget Harriet Tubman, who single-handedly led over 300 slaves to freedom. Community service at its best. The colored women have not been backward in promoting charities for their own race and their sex, coming to Frances Ellen Parker, activist and writer in the 1880s and 1990s. Throughout our history, Black women have been quite instrumental in building a number of needed institutions, for they helped provide for many schools, orphanages, and other institutions. And when the Civil War left a generation of women without men, as observed by the Southern historian Anne Fryer Scott, many women had to show their resourcefulness, and many were forced to either manage plantations or they were forced to work. This ignited the belief that the efforts of Black women were essential for reform and progress, and that the moral standing was a steady rock upon which the race could lean. Black women activists believed that the Black community was at a standstill, a crossroads, abandoned by the federal government, subjected to increasing violence and shorn of political power. It would either be pushed into oblivion or mobilize its resources and survive. Anna Jewel Cooper wrote in her Voice of the South, 1892, one of the best written books of the period. It was a Black woman who must stamp will or woe on the coming history of our people. She also quoted to a group of black clergymen that only the black woman can say when and where I enter. Then and there, the whole Negro race enters with me. Between 1892 and 1894, black women's clubs proliferated throughout the country as a result of Ida B. Wells' crusade against lynching. The clubs, as noted in the Woman's Era, a black woman's publication, were not organized for race work alone, but for the work along the lines that made the progress for women, states Career Ruffin, the editor. Black women organizations were the platform, the basis, the foundation of not only community service, but for women's rights as well. Ida B. Wells, a formidable woman in her own right, having initiated and directly impacted the number of lynchings taking place in America, was once agitated by the president of the Missouri Press Association, who was so moved to publish an open letter about the work Mrs. Wells was doing. He addressed the letter to an English woman accusing Ms. Wells and all Afro-American women of having no sense of virtue and being altogether without character. This was a calling that organized 100 women in 1895 from 10 states to meet and formulate plans for a national federation. Ida B. Wells was indeed the catalyst and the creation for the first black women's organization. It was an official demand for justice, for the race, and for women, and it propelled them on to the next stage of their political development. The National Federation of Afro-American Women united 36 clubs in 12 states. Thereafter, similar efforts to initiate clubs were taking place by the National League of Colored Women in Washington, D.C., headed by Mary Church Terrell, who had recently married Booker T. Washington. By 1896, the uniting of the Federation and the League into the National Association of Colored Women, NACW, was also led by Terrell as its first president. The founding meeting in Washington, D.C. was quite a milestone in Israel. The meeting was well attended by women who personified the struggles of the past and of the present. Community service, progress at its best. Ida B. Wells must have been pleased. Her anti-lynching campaign had not only helped to launch the modern civil rights movement, but it brought black women into the forefront of the struggle for black and women's rights. The NACW was quite influential in the making of black women's history, as Ruffin states, "We are not alienating or withdrawing. We are only coming to the front." In less than 20 years after its founding, the NACW represented 50,000 women in 28 federations and over 1,000 clubs. The organization did not question the superiority of the middle-class values or way of life, nor did they have any idealistic notions of the inherent nobility of the poor, uneducated masses. Instead, education, material progress were the values they promoted. Though there had for some time been black women activists, and although many other women's organizations were being created, they all did more than pursue cultural activities. The Ohio Literacy Ladies Society, for example, probably did more towards the establishment for schools for black children than any other group of the time in the state. Societies also helped needy black women, gave financial aid to black newspapers, and provided forums for discussion of relevant issues. The Afro-American Female Intelligence Society of Boston sponsored a young abolitionist speech before a mixed audience of men and women. A daring act, because the abolitionist was a woman, and a black woman at that. In 1832, women didn't speak in public, and especially not on serious matters like civil rights, and most especially not on feminism. The concerns of these organizations were morals, education, and means. Black women were deeply disturbed about the society at large, which reflected their pragmatic racial concerns. The belief was that moral women were the cornerstone of good homes, and through the home, a people could become really good and great, as stated by Mary Church Terrell, who also said, "It is with our women that the purity and the safety of our families rest. And what the families are, the race will be." This distress at the time was based on the urgent need for health care. Sound familiar? Health conditions among large number of blacks were perilous, so perilous that an 1899 conference at Atlanta University concluded that if conditions weren't improved, the race could actually be destroyed. Nutrition, diseases, and insufficiency were examples of the state of the communities. Josephine Bruce, wife of Blanche K. Bruce, the Reconstructor United States Senator from Mississippi, explained the mother in the home as the teacher in the schoolroom and the woman in the church set the standards for the multitude. So women organizations place their importance on mothers cultivating a thirst for knowledge in their children, by which nurturing these noble qualities, the hissing and the reproach toward the race would cease. We believe, stated Terrell, we can build the foundation of the next generation upon such a rock of morality, intelligence, and strength, that the floods of proscription, prejudice, and persecution may descend upon it in torrents, and yet it will not be moved. Community service at its best. The NCNW urged their clubs to immediately establish day nurses and to set up committees specifically for this purpose. They raised money to send out a kindergarten organizer whose duties were to arouse the conscience of our women and to establish kindergartens wherever means, therefore, could be secured. Noted by author Anna Junior Cooper, our girls as well as our boys flocked into schools and battled for an education. But it was particularly important for women to get an education because the majority of them had to work. And since their occupations were limited to teaching in colored schools or domestic service, as Fannie Barrow Williams observed, an education not only had a dramatic impact on their status and quality of life, but often shielded women from the sexual harassment that many of them confronted in white homes. As a result of all these efforts, black women rose to the top in staggering numbers. By the turn of the century, Booker T. Washington's National Business League reported 160 black female physicians, 7 dentists, 10 lawyers, 164 ministers, do you hear me? Journalists, writers, and teachers, and 13,525 instructors. Black women were graduating from high-ranking schools and universities by 1905, and this increase in the political, economic, and social concerns of black women attending college triggered the founding of the largest sororities, Alpha Kappa Alpha in 1908 and Delta Sigma Theta in 1913, but please, let me keep bragging. By 1904, black women had accumulated some $700 million in real property. They helped to raise over $14 million for education of children, and educated more than 25,000 teachers of our own race. Do you know that that equates to $34 billion in today's purchasing power? Can I get a hallelujah? Community service at its best. By no means were boys and men left out of the educating equation. Club women also brainstormed on the philosophy of black self-help, mutual aid, and racial pride. Anna Junior Cooper stated, I believe in industrial education with all my heart, and that we can all be professional people, but we must have a backbone to the race. With that, school founders like Charlotte Hawkins Brown and Mary McLeod Bethune brought about the idea of industrial education, trades that our black men could immediately find work in. Adding such trades also to the curriculum aided in obtaining monies from prospective white donors. The tremendous impact of World War I made worse an already bad situation for blacks. Nationwide inflation, cotton-killing bogles in the South increased the cost of living index while wages were going down. The economic situation had a vice-like grip, and with it, the convict system. Twice as many black men than white, and 8 times as many black women than white were being killed. But for those who managed to escape, remain out of prison, labor conditions worsened. The Women's Trade Union called for equal treatment in the labor force. The AFL appointed a black social worker, Mildred Rankin, to head the National Office of Colored Women Workers. And when it became clear that the blacks would have to organize, they They actually organized